Tales of Long Ago, written by Martha Thomas Sumner, read by her daughter, Gertrude Sumner Humphries. Chapter 1. The Heritage of the Land. In writing these stories, I hope to preserve for future generations some of the customs of earlier days. I grew up in a neighborhood where the inhabitants had kept in use many of the old customs and traditions which had long since been cast aside by those who lived in other more progressive communities. I've always felt that I was fortunate to have had such a heritage. If you are interested in folklore, you will find it spread here and there through all the pages. The large family in which I was born was not particularly interested in how the outside world lived. They were primarily concerned with their own immediate surroundings, their homes, their kindred, their neighbors, their church, and their school. Much of the large farm on which I was brought up was still covered with virgin forest. All of the shrubs and trees that were native to that locality were to be found growing somewhere on the land. There were old fields on the farm which had been abandoned when they had lost their fertility or erosion had set in. They had been left for nature to restore them in any way she saw fit. Some of them were covered with a considerable growth of young cedar interspersed with dogwood. Other fields had a scattered growth of small dogwood, persimmon, and oak, with clumps of blackberry briar spread here and there over all the field. The ground was covered with coarse wild grass and a tangle of sawbriars. All the weeds and wild plants that grew in that section had found in these old fields an unrestricted place to live. They were veritable flower gardens from early spring until late autumn. In April, the dogwood opened its white bracts. In May, the blackberry briars were white with bloom. In June, the wild roses opened their delicate pink blossoms. In July, the blackberries ripened their luscious fruit with overtones of half-ripe, bright red berries on the same briars. In August, the white and purple asters came in for a long period of bloom. In September, the goldenrod added its flowers as a last grand display. But it was in October, when all things had come to fruition, that the old fields inclined to magnificence with the russet color of dogwood foliage and scarlet berries, the reddish-yellow fruit of the persimmon, the scarlet foliage and red drupes of the sumac, the orange and red leaves of the sassafras with their blue berry-like fruit, the scarlet hips of the wild rose, and the sawbriars with their motley leaves of rose red and green. As we gathered blackberries, service berries, and wild plum in summer, and haws, grapes, and persimmons in the autumn, we had an excellent chance to study birds, wildflowers, shrubs, and trees. With an eye for natural beauty and splendor, I saw the loveliness of the flowers and the majesty of the trees. With an ear for wild music, I heard the birds' songs, learned to know the different species, found their nests, and saw their eggs. I learned that certain birds remained with us all through the year, that other birds wintered here and went north to spend the summer and raise their young, that still other birds went south in winter and came here in the spring to pass the summer and build their nests, and that there were many species that stopped here for only a few days in spring to rest and feed on their long flight from a warm climate to some far northern land, and that they often stopped again as they went south in the autumn. Accompanied by my sisters, I went through the forests and fields in quest of various things at different seasons. An entomologist would have been delighted with the insects we found living in the old fields when we went there to gather berries. Occasionally we would walk too close to a yellow jacket's nest. The little fiery creatures would swarm up out of the ground and not only attack us but would chase us for some distance. Sometimes as we ran through the tangle of sawbriars, which scratched our legs and often tripped us even when we were walking, someone would fall and receive a few stings. This was not regarded as a major discomfort, however. Our greatest find would be a hornet's nest swung to a lower branch of a small tree in the middle of a nice berry patch. These nests were often as large as a 2-gallon bucket. The hornets were vicious, but they did not pursue us for any great distance when we molested them. After they had gone back to the nests and resumed their usual activities, I would disturb them again by throwing another small piece of decayed fence rail or dead stick at their nest. The other children would stand far enough away not to get stung, but close enough to watch the game. I had almost no fear of hornets or any other insects, as they did not sting me. I noticed the hornets often built their nests near the edge of the field and close to the woods, that their smooth, thin, tough nests were the exact color of the old decayed fence rails and dead tree trunks. It was then I learned that they used dead wood in the construction of their nests. When we had filled our buckets with berries, we were tired and thirsty. With the interlined, neatly quilted, stiffly starched crowns of our chambray sunbonnets a little wilted, our hands slightly scratched, our fingers stained, we would start toward home. After we had left the old field, we would walk a quarter of a mile through the deep, cool woods, then another quarter of a mile down the open, sunny lane to the house, where Mother would be waiting to can the berries. After we had quenched our thirst with water from the deep, rock-lined well in the front yard, we would rest within the peaceful shelter of our home. Chapter 2. My Earliest Recollections. Grandmother was one of 5 children. Her deceased husband had 6 brothers and sisters. These sons and daughters of early settlers had married and made their homes in 3 adjoining communities. They had multiplied and replenished the sparsely settled neighborhoods. Most of them lived to a ripe old age. My grandfather lived to be 83. 9 years later, when my grandmother died at the same age, she left 124 descendants. They all lived in her immediate vicinity. Grandfather had given 7 sons and the daughter, each a share of the original 3,000-acre tract, and they had settled on it. My father was the youngest son. After grandfather's death, he married and continued to live in the old home with my grandmother. I was born in this old home and spent my early years there. Old persons were not neglected in those days. The weather was never too hot nor too cold to prevent grandmother's relatives from visiting her. Some of them would come in wagons. Others would ride horseback. Many of them lived near enough to walk. We had visitors every day. To invite friends to have a meal was unheard of, and no one ever took the trouble to send the message that they were coming to make a visit. Unless a person or the whole family ate at least one meal, it was not considered a visit. We seldom ate a meal without guests. Nothing extra was provided for the visitors. They ate whatever Mother had planned to have, but the quantity, of course, had to be increased. Ample provisions were kept on hand at all times. The flour bin in the kitchen held 1,000 pounds of flour. It had a top that was hinged on and could be let back against the wall. There was a smaller box which held 6 bushels of cornmeal. When the supply of flour and meal was getting low, my father would fill sacks with wheat and corn and take them to the mill 6 miles away and have the grain ground into flour and meal. The miller said when he saw a wagon coming down the long hill to the river, loaded with grain in snowy white sacks, he always knew it was one of the Thomas family. Women who let their menfolk use sawed or unbleached sacks were looked down on by grandmother and her daughter and 8 daughters-in-law. Pork was served at every meal. It was grandmother's rule to butcher 300 pounds of pork for each member of the family, including small children, and then add 300 pounds for visitors. A shoat was always killed in the fall to be eaten fresh. The rest of the hogs were butchered in December. There was fresh sausage, spare ribs, and backbones for winter use, and plenty of smoked joints and bacon to last through the spring and summer months. In summer there were fresh vegetables from the garden, roasting ears from the fields, fruit from the orchard, blackberries from the old fields, and a large watermelon patch which also had muskmelons and citrons. In autumn large quantities of walnuts and hickory nuts were picked up after they had fallen from the trees. They were hulled and stored for winter. And always there were several bushels of popcorn, which usually was popped over embers in the large wooden fireplace after supper. Wild grapes were plentiful in the woods. They were good to eat and made nice jelly also. There were persimmons, or possum apples as they were sometimes called, in the old fields. These were good to eat after the first frost. In winter there were scores of bushels of sweet potatoes, white potatoes, and turnips. There were bags of dried peas and beans and fruit. There were glass jars of peaches and blackberries. There were jams and preserves in stone jars, and New Orleans molasses in 5-gallon kegs. There were cucumbers in brine in large stone jars. These were made into pickle about 2 gallons at a time as needed. There were chickens and eggs at all seasons. Mother raised a few chickens at the house in the spring, and Father let them raise themselves at the stable all through the spring, summer, and fall. Who prepared the food for so many guests? Well, Grandmother's relatives always lent a helping hand. The women would come with their aprons on. They were made of black and white check gingham, cut long, and gathered to a waistband. The women not only helped with the preparation of the meal, but with the dishwashing and other chores as well. When Grandmother was sick, and she was in bed at intervals for 9 years, some of the women would sit with her while others would help in the kitchen. One morning Aunt Emily and several other women were taking care of Grandmother. That was the morning to churn the milk and make the butter. Aunt Emily told Mother to let her know when the milk had turned, and she would churn. It was several steps from the kitchen to Grandmother's room, so at the proper time my older sister Lily was sent to deliver the message. I followed along behind her. She walked boldly into the room and said, "Emily, you can come and churn now." Aunt Emily got up slowly. She was a large woman and was getting along in years. Moreover, she always rode horseback when she came to our house, and this made her right knee, which of course was the one she held over the saddle horn, pretty stiff. As she slowly walked out of the room, she said, "I don't suppose these children will ever have any manners." This embarrassed me. I was a sensitive, bashful child, but it passed over Lily as easily as water pours off a duck's back. Living in an atmosphere like that, our mother did not have time to give us the care we needed or the correction we sometimes should have had. We called our father and everyone else except Mother and Grandmother by their names. Father did not mind us calling him by his name. It amused him. He must have known that we would quit it when we became a little older, that we were merely imitating the persons around us. A short time after the episode with Aunt Emily, Lily and I decided between ourselves that we would call our father Pappy, pronounced with a short A, and that we would put a handle to the names of nearly all our aunts, uncles, and married cousins. There were a few among them, however, that for reasons which were strictly personal, we decided to continue to call by their names. In most cases, they were persons who teased us about our red hair. At that time, red hair was considered almost a disgrace by some of the members of the family and other persons who lived in our community. Chapter 3. Grandmother's House. When my grandfather first settled on his land, he built a log room that was 28 feet long and 20 feet wide. This served as a living room. He soon built another large log room which was used as a kitchen and dining room. In this first room, Grandmother bore 11 children. She reared 9 of them in it and the half-story bedroom above it. When the other rooms were built at a much later date, the kitchen was torn down, but Grandmother's room was left. The ceiling and walls were plastered and given a coat of white calcimine. Weatherboards were put on the outside walls and painted white to match the rest of the house. It was like that when I was born. At the east end of Grandmother's room, a door opened into my mother's bedroom, which she also used as a sitting room. Beyond Mother's room, there was a small guest room, a long dining room, and a large square kitchen, which formed the stem of the L-shaped house. The wide south porch, which started with Grandmother's room, like Mary's lamb, followed everywhere the house went. One could enter every room on the first floor from this L-shaped porch. On the north side of the house, there was another long, wide porch that opened off Grandmother's room and Mother's. This was the front porch, but few persons ever came in that way. The west end of Grandmother's room was toward the road. In the center of this wall there was a brick chimney with a fireplace that held logs nearly 4 feet long. In winter the fire usually was made up in the late afternoon. It would take a strong man to bring in the back log and put it in the fireplace. Ashes would be packed behind the log and at each end to prevent its burning out too soon. Another large log would be placed on the back log to throw heat out into the room. Small sticks would be laid in front on the dog irons. A few small logs were kept in the wood box to be put on the fire when needed, and a pile of wood was always kept on the south porch. On the south side of the wide fireplace there was a narrow, winding stairway with a closet underneath it. There was a door at the fourth step which was always kept closed. We were not allowed to play upstairs. The 3 windows in Grandmother's room were like those in the rest of the house. They had 15 small panes, 9 in the upper sash and 6 in the lower. From the window by the fireplace one could see the front gate and the road. From another window one could look out on the south porch. From the third window one could look out on the north porch. In this room, with its 3 windows, 3 doors, staircase, and wide fireplace, there was still ample wall space for the furniture. It would take a cabinet maker to describe the furniture in Grandmother's room. There were 2 bedsteads made of walnut, a wide lounge, a chest of drawers, a press, and 2 small tables made of the same wood. There was a china cabinet made of cherry. All of these were beautifully designed and well made. The corded beds had frames which were made of white oak splits, on which rested ticks that were filled with clean wheat straw. Huge ticks that were filled with goose feathers were placed on top of the straw ticks. The sheets were woven by hand of thread which had been spun from homegrown cotton. The blankets were made of wool which had been sheared, washed, carded, and spun at home. The woolen coverlets were made by hand the same way. In summer, the blankets and coverlets were packed away in walnut chests, and handmade quilts were used. Grandmother had many beautiful quilts, which included the Rose of Sharon, the Drooping Lily, and the Tulip. The lounge was placed in the middle of the room, about halfway between the fireplace and the 2 large beds at the back of the room. Regardless of the number of relatives that came in to spend the night, Grandmother always slept on the lounge. There was space between the lounge and the wide brick hearth for a semicircle of straight chairs. A dozen persons could sit there. There were no rocking chairs. The windows had dark green blinds which were tacked to the top of the window frame. 2 long strings were tacked to the frame, one over and one under the blind, which made it possible to roll the blind to the desired height and keep it there by tying the strings together in a bow knot. These shades were seldom let down. In winter, the light from the windows on the sides of the room served as beacons to guide relatives who were walking across the fields or down the lanes on their way to visit Grandmother. The calico curtains at the windows had a red background with green and tan gourds climbing up them. This was not the calico we wore in later years that could be bought for 5 cents a yard. This material was closely woven, and its color stayed fresh and bright for many years, withstanding the sun's bright rays and the frequent washings with homemade lye soap. A Brussels carpet with a sulphur-colored background and soft red flowers covered the floor. It had a layer of wheat straw under it. The doors, windows, their frames, chair rail, base, and hand-carved mantel were painted a light dull brown. The half-story bedroom above, Grandmother's room, had never been finished. One could see the log walls and the clapboard roof. There were 5 full-size beds there, fitted out exactly like those in the room below. The 8 sons had slept in these beds when they were boys, and still used them when they spent the night. When the second bedroom was added, over Mother's room, the logs were not sawed out. To reach the door, one had to go up a few steps and then down another short flight into the room. If some wayfarer who was passing through this primitive neighborhood stopped and asked to spend the night, he was put there to sleep. No one was turned away. The oldest bedding was used there, as boiling the quilts was the only way Grandmother knew to disinfect them. The spinning wheels were kept in this room when they were not in use. Grandmother kept the most of her clothing in the first room upstairs. Her long-tailed black sunbonnets were hung in a row on wooden pegs. Her everyday bonnet was plain. Narrow strips of cardboard, which could be removed when the bonnet was laundered, were inserted in the machine-stitched slots of the crown. Her second-best bonnet and her very best bonnet had stiff quilted crowns and were trimmed with narrow ruffles. The only difference between them was that the second-best bonnet had been laundered. It was not considered suitable to wear to a funeral or even to the once-a-month Saturday morning service at the church. Any woman who wore a bonnet that had been laundered on such occasions was thought to be slipshod or slovenly. The second-best bonnets were worn when visiting relatives in the week. A shower or light snowfall did not hurt them, as they could be laundered again. Grandmother had some fancy little black poke bonnets with ribbons tied under the chin, a black silk dress with boned basque and shirred skirt, a rustling petticoat and hoops, and there was a black riding skirt that had turned brownish from long disuse. The object I admired most was a little parasol. It was made of wine-colored brocaded satin with raised black flowers and had an ivory handle. One day, when Grandmother was asleep on the lounge, Lily and I tiptoed up the stairway and opened the little parasol. Just as we were about to put it over our red heads, we remembered that it brought bad luck to folk to hold an umbrella over them in the house. We had barely missed something terrible that day. Very solemnly but longingly, we put the parasol away and went quietly down to the yard to play. Grandmother loved flowers. Without the expert advice of a landscape gardener, she beautified her homestead. Besides the tall rose bush for the doorway and the hop vine that shaded the south porch from the afternoon sun, there were a few well-placed shrubs in the yard: lilac, althea, burning bush, and mock orange. There were 2 tall cedars and a juniper. Grandmother planted a border of fall-growing, flowering shrubs in the lower yard by the roadside that screened the large potato patch and the log utility house from those who passed by. On the upper or north side of the yard there was a vegetable garden. Between that and the road there was a border of flowering trees and shrubs: serviceberry, wild plum, and spicewood. There was a border of perennials in the garden with pinks, verbena, bleeding heart, and peony. There was also a border of lilacs and one of herbs. Flowering shrubs and perennials continued to bloom for many years after Grandmother had gone. I always thought they were a more fitting monument to her than the marble stone that marked her grave in the family burying ground on the slope near the house. Chapter 4. Grandmother's Last Illness. It was August. The weather was hot. The roads were dusty. All day long Grandmother lay on the walnut lounge, very ill. There was no nurse. The relatives took care of her. There were 20 or more guests each day. The 8 devoted sons and the daughter were grieved. The daughters-in-law, nieces, nephews, and grown-up grandchildren wore grave faces. All day there was a coming and going of persons who were not of the immediate family. Horses were tied to both hitching racks. Ladies' long, lined, full-gathered black riding skirts were hung neatly across the yard fence near the stile block. Lily and I were left the greater part of each day to amuse ourselves as best we could. She was 5 and I was 4. One day right after noon, Mother came into the kitchen and said, "Don't waste the biscuits today, girls." She never had said that before. There must have been more company that day than usual. It being summer, supper would be served cold. About mid-afternoon we went into the kitchen, as was our custom, to eat some blackberry jam or syrup and biscuit. It took something sweet to pep us up, to keep us going until night. After we had scooped out the middle of the biscuits and eaten as many crusts as we liked, Mother's words popped into our minds like shells exploding. What could we do? Something would have to be done. We took an inventory, so to speak. There were 2 plates stacked high with cornbread. This was reddish for the Thomas family. And there were 2 plates heaped with biscuits, and plates were large in Grandmother's day. and what lovely blue plates they were. After a few seconds' thought, we decided to quarter each biscuit, thereby making them go much farther. It took so many plates to hold the quartered biscuits from the first plate that we thought it best to break those on the second plate into halves only. This being done, we put the biscuits in the safe and went back to our plate. I have no recollection of the furor this must have caused, or what was done to relieve the situation when it was time for supper, as we made ourselves conspicuous by our absence from the kitchen and dining room that evening. But I do know this. There were no cars then in which one could go whizzing into town for bread, and there was no bread to be had, even if one could have gone driving into town after. When it was bedtime, Mother dragged us out from under our bed, where we had gone to sleep tired and hungry, and gave us each a sound spanking. We went to bed without taking off our dresses or even washing our feet that night. When the noise of our sudden shrieks rent the air, it must have sounded strange to the persons in the quiet adjoining room who sat waiting for Father Time, who was hovering near to clip the brittle thread which held Grandmother's soul captive there. Mary. Two of the daughters-in-law had the same name. We added the name of each one's husband and called them Mary Tom, Mary Jim, or Mary Perry to tell them apart. One day, when the three Aunt Marys were sitting in the room with Grandmother, an old hen, whose head had been addled by the intense August heat, walked into the room, stopped at the foot of the lounge where Grandmother lay, and crowed. This was thought to be a bad omen. There would be a death in the family. One of the aunts went to the kitchen and told the women who were preparing the noon meal about it. Another aunt went out to the front yard where the men were sitting under a shade tree and told them what had happened. That night, a dear little black-eyed, black-haired baby sister came to live with us. Mother named her Mary after both grandmothers. We thought the crowing hen had brought us good luck instead of bad. Grandmother's wrinkled face was wreathed with smiles when the new baby was wrapped in a blanket and carried to the bed for her to see the next day. September went by. October came with its cooler weather. One day riders were sent out to call the sons and daughters. Grandmother was worse. She was dying, perhaps. When Uncle Will got the message, he was out in the field cutting tobacco. He went to the house to wash his gum from his hands and put on clean clothes. His youngest daughter, Cousin Jenny, had to go to the girls' room upstairs and sit while he was making preparation to go, lest he see her laughing. Grandmother had been sick so long, almost 9 years, and the children had been called in so many times, only to find her as well as usual by the time they got there, that it had become a joke with Cousin Jenny. Mother told me to go to the meat house and tell Caroline to come in, that Grandmother was dying. The hired girl was standing on a short ladder, getting down a piece of smoked meat to cook for dinner. It seemed she was always getting down either a shoulder or a ham. In her excitement, she dropped the sharp knife that she was going to use to cut the strong cord, and it barely missed my head. Continued on 1B. In a short time, the house and even the doorway was filled with people. Grandmother's children, grandchildren, relatives, and neighbors had come to mourn her passing. Her emaciated form was on the lounge as usual, but her spirit had taken its flight to that celestial city which she often saw by faith as clearly as we could see the sunshine of that bright October day. The next day after Grandmother's death, one of the largest crowds that had ever assembled for a funeral in that neighborhood met at her old home and walked behind the small black hearse to the graveyard where the funeral was held. All of her 124 descendants, and nearly all of her nieces, nephews, their children, and grandchildren, were there to pay her a last tribute of respect. There were many tears shed as the long procession filed past her coffin for a last look at her kind face. There beside her husband, and near their 2 daughters who had died in childhood, she was laid to rest, amid the scenes she had loved so well, and close to the place where she had done her best to make a home. If by chance grandmother's ghost ever walked over that home of the dead, and came in contact with the ghosts of her former slaves, who were buried there also, they must have been glad to meet her again. She had treated them kindly, and had looked after their welfare in slavery, and had taken an interest in them after their emancipation. Chapter 6. Grandmother's Things Divided. A few days after grandmother's death, her sons and daughter met at our house to divide her personal belongings. They took 9 large pieces of furniture of nearly equal value and numbered them. Then the same numbers were written on small slips of paper, which were put into a hat. Uncle Fant passed the hat, and each one drew a number from it. Lily and I stayed in the room. We wondered why Uncle Jim shut his eyes before he drew a slip, as the numbers were all folded into small bits. Smaller pieces of furniture, such as chairs and tables, were numbered and divided in the same way. Then the feather beds, pillows, hand-woven coverlets, blankets, quilts, sheets, pillowcases, and table linens were divided. Grandmother's clothes were put out. The brothers very generously gave Aunt Mary nearly all of them. Lily asked for the parasol and a woolen balmoral. I held my breath. I would have given anything for the parasol, but I was too bashful to get the words out. Uncle Fant, without consulting Aunt Mary, handed Lily the parasol. The china and glassware divided last. Father got a beautiful china teapot, and Aunt Mary got the cups and saucers that went with it. Their descendants still have them. It was too bad that they were not put together that day. Our uncles had come in their wagons. After everything had been divided, they helped each other load the furniture carefully. Then each one of them gathered up his reins and drove quietly away. That night, grandmother's possessions were in 9 different homes. There they were kept by her descendants down through the ages. They were treasured, too. That would have pleased grandmother. She took care of everything, and especially things that had been made laboriously by hand. That evening, Lily and I went upstairs to play. It was quiet and empty there. All the interesting things were gone. We would never see them again, except when we visited our aunts and uncles, and they would not look the same there. My breath came in gasps, and there was a lump in my throat. We couldn't say a word, and for once our feet were still. We went quickly and quietly down the stairs. We stopped in the room where grandmother had lived. The windows had the same curtains and blinds. Nobody had changed them. We looked at the things our father had left in the room. There were 2 bedsteads made of cherry, a china cabinet, and a chest of drawers of the same wood. There was another chest of drawers and a gate-legged table made of walnut, and of course his share of all the other things were there. We were lonely and sad. We hurried from the room and went to find our mother and baby sister. Everything seemed the same in there. There was serenity and love. Then we went to the kitchen. The hired girl made us feel welcome, but somehow we scarcely could swallow a mouthful of food that evening. Everything was all right, and yet it was so different. The house seemed so empty with all the people gone from it. We knew that grandmother had gone forever. She loved us and had always been so kind to us. Chapter 7. The Meat House. Grandmother's meat house was the largest outbuilding in the main or upper yard. It was made of hewn trunks of oak, with clapboards nailed over the cracks between the logs. It had a rough oaken plank floor. In the center of the front end of the room there was a wide, heavy door, which was made of rough planks with battens nailed across it. The tiers, or they were sometimes called tier poles, were made of small round logs which had been barked. They were placed in 3 double rows across the center of the house, one above the other. On the left side of the room and toward the back there was a large squared trough that had been made from a poplar trunk. The inside of this trough was 2 feet wide, 2 feet deep, and 12 feet long. The side and end walls and bottom were 3 inches thick. After the hogs were butchered, dressed, and cut out, the meat was salted down in this trough, except the heads and jaws, which were put into a smaller trough that was across the back of the room. This trough was also made of poplar, but in a different shape. A large poplar log had been split through the center with a broadaxe. This trough had been dug out of one of the halves. After the meat had been in the trough for several weeks, it would be taken up and washed in cold water to remove the salt. Then short slits would be made with a pocket knife through each piece, and strong cords would be run through the openings. These cords were hung on tobacco sticks, 2 pieces of meat to a stick. The tobacco sticks would be placed across the tiers, and the meat would be smoked. In the center of the floor there was a rough plank frame or box built upon legs, which was 5 feet long, 4.5 feet wide, and about 2 feet deep. This was filled with garden soil. Chips would be brought in from the woodpile, and each day a small fire would be kept burning in the middle of this box until the meat was thoroughly smoked. When the pieces above the box were brown, they would be taken down and hung farther away from the fire, and other pieces would be placed there. Things other than meat were kept in the meat house. The 2 salt barrels stood on the right of the door. Beyond the salt barrels, on the right side of the room, there were 4 large iron-bound barrels which were used for soap and soap grease. When a ham or shoulder was taken to the kitchen, the skins would be taken from that portion which was to be fried and placed in a stone crock. When the crock was full, it would be taken to the meat house and emptied into the barrel that were kept for that purpose. These skins and hocks would be collected from one spring until the next, as the family's supply of soap was always made at that time. In the next 2 barrels were kept the soft lye soap. Soap was never used until it had been made a year. When the new soap was made, there was a barrel of old soap ready for use. This soft soap would be dipped out a gallon at the time in a stone jar and taken to the kitchen, where it was used to wash the dishes and clothes, to scrub the kitchen chairs and floor, and to do any other cleaning job that required the use of soap. The cider and vinegar barrels were kept on the left side of the meat house. They started near the door and went back to the end of the large trough. Fresh cider was put into one of the barrels. Cider that had been made the year before and was in the process of making vinegar was kept in another one, and vinegar was in the third one. If any mother came out of the barrel while vinegar was being drawn from it, it would be put into the cask which held the year-old cider. This would hasten the process of making it into cider. Unlike the soap and grease barrels, which stood on their flat heads and were covered with tops that had been made from the end boards which had been removed, the vinegar barrels were placed on their sides. Bricks were used to prevent them from rolling or slipping. A hole was bored on the top side with a 2-inch auger, and a bung made of seasoned wood was fitted tightly into it. A large, long-necked gourd that had both ends sawed off and was used as a funnel to pour cider into the barrel was always kept hanging on a nail above them. A short ladder was kept standing against a low tier pole so that a person could climb up on it and take down a piece of meat when it was needed. Chapter 8. The Wash House. Unlike the utility room of today, which is a part of the main dwelling, my grandmother's wash house was in the lower yard and some distance from the kitchen. This room was 20 feet square and was built of logs. It had 2 doors which were made of rough plank, one in the center of the front wall and the other in the back. It had no windows. The floor was made of wide, rough planks that had worn smooth from long use, and the broad hearth was made of dirt. A crane was fastened in the center of the wide brick chimney, where a large iron kettle was hung on wash day to heat water and to boil the white clothes after they had been thoroughly rubbed on a zinc washboard. There was a small well in the corner of the lower yard which had been dug near the wash house so the water would be convenient. But as it was lined with limestone, the water was hard, and it was seldom used. Water had to be packed in buckets, either from the well or cistern in the upper end of the front yard. The 2 long clotheslines were in the upper yard behind the main dwelling. A great many unnecessary steps were taken in carrying heavy buckets of water to the wash house and wet clothes from it to the lines. The wash house was used for several purposes. At hog killing time, the women would take off the fat in the wash house. A rough table was kept there for that purpose. After the fat from the entrails had been put into the 3 large iron kettles and swung over the fire to cook, the other fat and lean meat, which had been trimmed from the heads, jaws, sides, shoulders, and hams, would be cut on the table into lard and sausage. As soon as possible, the other kettles would be placed with their short legs in bricks on each end of the hearth, and live coals would be taken in shovelfuls from the fireplace and put under them. Chips would be added as they were needed. In a short time, the kettles would be filled with fat sizzling in intense heat. It kept one person busy stirring the 3 kettles of lard with a wide open paddle, which had been made for that purpose and was kept for year to year, hanging on its special nail by the fireplace. When a kettle of lard was done, the pot hooks would be placed in its ears, and 2 persons would lift it from the fire, where it would be strained through a cloth in a deep wooden-sided wire-bottomed sieve, which was kept for that purpose. It was strained into a large stone jar that had been heating near the fire. The jars of lard were covered and left there to cool. The next day, someone would take a broom handle and make a hole down through each jar to keep them from bursting in extreme cold weather. Then the men would take the jars to the milk house, which was the nearest outbuilding to the kitchen, and store the lard. While one person was cooking the lard, others would be grinding the sausage. After the sausage had been ground, as much of it as could be worked in one time would be put into a tub and seasoned. The woman who had charge of everything knew how much salt, sage, black pepper, and cayenne pepper was needed. Someone would roll up his sleeves and knead and turn the sausage for several minutes. Then a skillet would be placed on the fire, and several sausages would be fried. Everyone present, including the children, would taste them. It took a large sausage for one to get a real good taste, and sometimes a second one had to be eaten before a decision could be made as to whether anything was lacking. Occasionally a little more salt would be added, but it was seldom that anyone ever even hinted that more pepper was needed. On the 3rd day after the hogs were killed, the tubs of sausage would be put away. Some of it was packed into cloth sacks and rolled in flour to seal the porous cloth. These were hung up in the meat house, where in near zero temperature they often froze and kept fresh for several weeks. The rest of the sausage was fried and packed away in its own fat in stone jars to be used after the sausage in bags had been eaten. As the soap was nearly always made in the wash house, the ash hopper was placed near it. To build the ash hopper, 4 posts were set in a square 4 feet apart at a height of 4 feet, and scantlings were nailed across the top of them. 1/2 of a small log, which had been dug out to make a trough, was laid in the center between the posts, on 2 short, thick logs, which raised it about 2 feet from the ground and let it slope toward the front. Clapboards 4 feet long were placed down both sides of the trough and nailed to the scantlings on each side. The boards across the ends of the hopper were placed horizontally and were nailed to the post. In late winter, all the ashes that were taken from the fireplaces would be put into the ash hopper, which was kept well covered to keep the ashes from getting wet. When spring came and the ash hopper was full, definite plans would be made for making the year's supply of soap. The hopper would be uncovered, and each morning water would be poured on it. A stone jar would be placed under the trough to catch the first lye that dripped from it. The lye would be poured into large stone jars and kept in the wash house until there was enough to make the soap. Then the work would commence. All the soap grease would be taken from the meat house to the wash house. Cracklings in some jars, skins and hocks in others. No scales were used. After the grease had been put into the big kettles with the lye and had boiled for a few minutes, If either more grease or lye were needed, it would be added. Some women were experts in mixing the exact proportion of grease and lye that was needed to make soap. When soap was made, it was left to cool before it was taken to the meat house and poured into an empty soap barrel. The making of soap went on in this way until all the grease had been used. The loom on which my grandmother had woven so many yards of cotton and woolen material sat in the back of the wash house. It was not used much. Now and then in warm weather, and by the way the log house was always cool, one of the daughters-in-law would come and bring her carpet rags and warp, thread the loom, and weave a carpet. The carpet rags were narrow strips of cloth that had been torn from worn-out or discarded cotton garments and bedding. If the material was either white or faded, it was dyed fresh colors by using walnut, hickory, or red oak bark. Chapter 9. The Milk House. The milk house was built of small squared logs and had a dirt floor. It had a platform built around 3 of its sides, which was about 2 feet wide and several inches from the floor. Large stone jars, which were filled with lard, sat on the platform on 2 sides of the small room, and 10-gallon stone jars, which were filled with cucumbers in brine, were on the platform on the other side. In summer, the milk was kept in 2-gallon stone jars, which were put in water in brass-bound wooden tubs that sat on the dirt floor in the center of the house. This made the milk cool. The sills for another room, the exact size of the milk house, had been laid, and the corner posts set when the room was built. The same clapboard roof extended over it, but the sides and end were left open. The cider mill was kept under this roof, which not only protected it from the weather, but kept off the hot sunshine or rain at cider-making time. A barrel of tow that had been left over from my grandmother's last spinning of flax sat under the roof on a wooden platform next to the milk house. A small colony of bumblebees made their home in the tow. No one ever molested them, nor did they ever pester us. We children had a rope swing under the roof. One day, as I was running swiftly toward the swing, and a bumblebee was flying speedily toward her nest, we met in a head-on collision, and the bee stung me on the forehead. I went at once into the kitchen, where my mother made a paste of baking soda and water, which she applied to the sting. I then went back to the swing, where I swung as high and as long as I liked, without any fear of the bumblebees. On the other side was the sweet potato house. It was built of hewn logs, which were about a foot square. This room was 7 feet square on the outside, and was tall enough for a man to stand in. On the inside of the room, the earth had been excavated to a depth of 3 feet. This excavation was filled each summer with dry, dead leaves from the woods. After the sweet potatoes had been dug in the early autumn and thoroughly cured, they would be placed in the leaves in this tight, mud-chinked house for winter use. Once when my mother was in the potato house searching for potatoes in the leaves, she lost her wedding ring. It was never found. At another time, when the hired girl went there for potatoes, she saw a large chicken snake that had gone into the room to spend the winter. After that, we children never went inside the potato house to play. Chapter 10. The Slave Quarters. It was spring. The snowballs, mock oranges, and lilacs were in bloom. The red roses were just beginning to open. The sun was shining, and we were out in the front yard enjoying the balmy air and playing games when we saw 2 persons coming slowly down the lane. The 2 elderly Negro women hobbled through the front gate and around to the side porch. Mother asked them to have a seat and rest a while. They were making their annual visit to the place where they were born and had spent their childhood. Aunt Hasty and Aunt Marty had been born in slavery. Every spring they came back to visit their birthplace and the graveyard. They lived 4 miles away in the Free State, on land which my grandfather had given his ex-slaves. When they had rested and had had a drink of cool water, they went through the back gate into the orchard. They stopped down in the south corner of the orchard and looked about them. There was a large pile of sandstones which once had been a chimney. That and some long hand-hewn logs which were lying on the ground were all that was left of the slaves' cabins. A wild goose plum had either been planted there or had come up from a seed that had been dropped by a bird. A thicket of young trees had sprung up around the old mother tree. About 40 yards from the plum trees there was a hand-dug well lined with sandstone that had started to cave in. A post oak had grown up close by, and its roots had ruined the well. The women looked at the well, which had furnished water for the slaves, and then went back to the plum thicket. They sat down on a log and let their thoughts turn back to their childhood. They talked about old Massa and old Missus, who was sleeping in the graveyard, and for whom they had genuine affection. They talked about their own people who were resting in the graveyard too. The slaves had been buried in the right back corner. For 50 years after the war between the states, the Negroes who had been my grandfather's slaves and their descendants were all buried in the graveyard near our house. They were superstitious and thought it brought bad luck to a family to start a new graveyard. When there was a death among them, a certain old black man would come to the house and ask my father for the picks and shovels, which he always furnished them to dig the grave. When we saw him coming, we knew another one of the good old darkies had gone on to a better land, that his hard times here were over. As long as my father lived, when one of the darkies was buried at the graveyard, my mother would boil some good lean pork and bake a dishpan full of biscuits, which he would carry to the graveyard at noon. With tears in their eyes and with husky voices, Aunt Hasty and Aunt Marty sang a hymn. Then they hobbled away on their old worn shoes toward the graveyard. I got the impression from hearing the old darkies talk that slavery never should have been abolished, that the Negroes had to work harder after they were freed than they did when they were enslaved. According to their own words, their happiest days had been spent in slavery, for not a care did they have then, not a thought as to how they would obtain food and clothing. The aged women visited all the graves and paused there for a long time. They came out of the graveyard, and leaning heavily on their walking sticks, they stood there for some time. With dimming sight, they had no glasses, they looked back over the scenes again, the house, the orchard, and the fields. Then, after taking another look at the grassy plot where so many loved ones were sleeping, they started on the long walk toward home. We knew they would stop on the way and rest at Uncle Jim's, Uncle Fank's, and Aunt Mary's, partly because they were tired, but chiefly because they wanted to see their white folks again. Chapter 11. A Log Rolling. All through the winter, my father and the hired man had been busy in good weather clearing a 4-acre woodland. For several years, all the wood we had used had been taken from that piece of land, and the tobacco plant beds had been burned there. In the early spring, before the trees had put out their leaves, the men had girded all the largest trees. They took sharp axes and chopped around the trunks through the outer bark and sapwood, or alburnum, or about 2 feet from the ground. They did this in order to leave the trees standing. They would die, but could be used later to fire the dark tobacco and to be burned in the fireplaces and kitchen range. The largest trees had already been cut and hauled to a mill and sawed into lumber to be used in repairing the outbuildings and in making some new ones. Father and the hired man cut the saplings and undergrowth first and piled them in heaps. When they had seasoned, they burned them for tobacco plant beds. The small trees were cut and sawed into 8, 10, and 12-foot lengths and left on the ground. These logs would be rolled. One day my father told my mother he planned to have a log rolling the next day if the weather was suitable. He invited all the grown boys and able-bodied men who lived near us to help roll the logs. He also asked some old men who were not strong enough to lift heavy loads, but liked to go with their sons for the social part, as social events were few and far between in their lives. They liked to watch the men display their strength and boast of their own muscular force in earlier years when they were young and strong. When morning came, the weather was good. The younger children were told to stand at the front window in the family room and count the men as they passed by the house, so we would know how many we would have to cook dinner for. There were 17. Each man cut himself a hand stick of hickory or dogwood, about 5 feet long and 2½ inches thick. They barked the sticks and scraped them smoothly on both ends, so they would not be rough on their hands. Since farmers had become less wasteful with their timber, and all the large trees were either left standing or had been removed for saw logs, few logs were rolled after I was old enough to remember, but the name was still used. The logs were picked up, carried by hand, and piled in heaps to be used if needed. Often they were burned to get them out of the way. When everyone was ready, 3 men got on each side of an 8-foot log, placed their hand sticks under it, took a firm hold on the sticks, and walked away with it. 8 men moved the 10 and 12-foot logs. The strongest men carried the larger logs, and the weaker men handled the smaller ones. Mother was not worried because she had to prepare a meal for several men. She planned the meal the day before and made some preparation. We brought everything that we were going to cook into the kitchen. My place was in the cookroom to help Mother with the dinner. She filled the largest iron kettle, which held 3½ gallons and fitted in an eye of the home comfort range, with spare ribs. Dried black-eyed peas and the hock of a smoked pork shoulder were boiled in a smaller iron kettle. I peeled white potatoes and put them on to cook. Mother made the biscuits. I made the plain cornbread and cooked it on a baker on the top of the stove. I soon had a plate piled 6 inches high with hoe cakes, as they were called in our neighborhood. We opened 2 half-gallon glass jars of home-canned blackberries and made pies in 2 large granite-ware pans, which we baked in the oven. I put cucumber pickles in the glass dishes and filled the syrup stand with New Orleans molasses. Mother baked the biscuits in large black iron pans. The folding leaf table in the kitchen would not seat but 6 men comfortably, so we had 3 tables to serve. Some of the men rested in the family room while the others ate. The older men ate first. There was a great deal of good-humored banter among the young men as to who had done the most work or lifted the heaviest logs. Everyone was in a pleasant mood. After the men had eaten and rested, they went back to the new ground to finish rolling the logs. We ate dinner, washed the dishes and cook vessels, and settled down to cutting quilt pieces. That evening, when Father had helped feed the stock and came in to eat supper, he was tired. We were all glad the log rolling was over. Please remove this tape and insert number 2A in your machine. Cow that went everywhere. There were no wire fences in our neighborhood. The fields were fenced with rails which had been split from fresh-cut logs, usually red oak, black oak, or post oak. Farmers would make their rails in winter and repair their fences in the spring. This made a lot of hard work. In building a new fence, the worm would be laid first. Then a second rail would be added. Other rails would be placed on the fence until it was the desired height, which usually was 10 rails. Each corner would be staked with 2 rails which were crossed near the top. Another rail, which was called a rider, would then be placed in the crossed rails or stakes on top of the fence. Stakes and riders were used to keep the stock from pushing the fence down. In repairing a fence, old rails which had become rotten would be removed and new rails would be put in. The old rails which had been taken from the fence made excellent wood and were used in the kitchen stove. Sometimes the shiftless family would live near a landowner's field, and the men would be too lazy to cut a tree and saw and split it into wood for the kitchen stove. From time to time, the men and their womenfolk would take a rail here and there and use it for stove wood. In the spring, the fence would be so low it would have to be rebuilt before the farmer could plant his crop. When this happened, no one ever mentioned it to the guilty family. When they mentioned it to their relatives and more upright neighbors, they always said, "Their chickens have eaten up my fence again." Stock had free range. Some farmers would turn out their horses and cattle in early spring to make their own living. Often they would make the better part of their living at the expense of other farmers. For this reason, my father and his brothers had to keep their fences repaired. When the milk cows were turned out in the morning and they failed to come home by milking time in the late afternoon, someone had to go out and look for them. If a woman did not know the sound of her cowbell, often she would go in the wrong direction after old Brennel. As a rule, there was plenty of milk in summer, as the cows usually freshened in early spring. But when winter came, even though the cows were kept up and fed, there was nearly always a scarcity of milk. Neighbors were generous. They gave buttermilk to one another to make biscuits and cornbread. All the hogs were descendants of ridge-rooters or razorbacks. There were no purebred cattle. There was one cow that was a well-known bovine character in at least 3 neighborhoods. No one ever said bull. They called him a cow. Although this cow was small and of scrub stock, he was a welcome guest to the farmers, but he was a terror to all the children. He would herald his approach with loud bellows. Then pawing, bawling, challenging, he would tear down fences wherever he went. No fence was high or strong enough to turn him back, not even a new 10-rail fence with stakes and riders. After he'd been on our farm for a few days, he would pass on to some other place. We never knew what his visits were expected to accomplish, as things of such nature were kept shrouded in mystery for several years. It was a great relief to us, however, when the cow went on to some other part of the neighborhood. While he was near our house, we were afraid to play in the orchard or the nearby fields and woods. Moreover, we could not visit our little friends, nor could they visit us. Chapter 13. A Perfect Day. It was the middle of April. The sun looked like a disk of fire as it climbed over the trees and spread its golden beauty over the fields. A gentle breeze found the fragrance of the apple and cherry blossoms. A tufted titmouse sang its spring song from an oak on the edge of the woods. A cardinal sang in the plum tree, and a pair of house wrens were bubbling over with happiness. Chipping sparrows hopped about on the front lawn, pausing now and then to give their soft chip, chip, chip. A downy woodpecker called sharply as it searched for wood in the maple trunk. Red-bellied woodpeckers' harsh cries came from the woods. A flicker's rolling call and his steady tap, tap on wood was heard as he worked on a home for his family. Killdeer called sharply from the meadow, and the crows called as they flew out of the woods and across the fields. English sparrows quarreled noisily with the blue jays on the roof of the hen house as they waited for the chickens to be fed so they could gobble their breakfast. The turnip patch looked like a strip of gold. Butterflies danced over it, and honeybees buzzed continually as they passed from one flower to another. As I swept the porches, the beauty of the morning and the happiness all around me caused me to linger a few moments before I went inside to finish the rest of my morning chores. Lucy, the little girl on the next farm, came to look for a goose's nest. After Grandmother passed away, Uncle Perry took the geese to his house. But the geese that had been raised at our place came back every spring to make their nest on the bank of a deep gully. We crossed the road and climbed over the rail fence. A mockingbird sang in the widespread maple, which was our favorite place to play. A meadowlark whistled on the fence near us. We walked across the apple orchard. The sassafras bushes that lined the back fence were as golden as the sunlight. We climbed over the rails and stopped on the bank between the fence and the deep, narrow gully. There was a little water in the bottom of the channel. We had a footbridge there made of rails we had taken from the fence, which we often crossed when we played there. But we did not cross over that morning. We kept quiet for some time as we tried to catch a glimpse of a white gander. Finally, we saw him standing down on the slope near the little stream of water. We took off our shoes and walked on the slope about halfway between the bank and the little stream. When the old gander saw us, he got angry. He stuck out his long neck and hissed at us. But Lucy had a stick, and after a few seconds he had to give ground and let us break up his home. The goose was on the nest, which was made of sticks and placed high above high water mark. They had arranged everything. As soon as the goslings got out of the shell, the little fellows could roll down the slope and take a swim the very first day with their parents. Lucy took the eggs home with her so Aunt Mary could put them under a chicken hen. Goslings are fond of tadpoles, but tadpoles are the death of little fluffy yellow goslings. We went as far as the tobacco barn with Lucy when she started home. The woods showed signs of spring. Hickory buds were swollen, and some of the trees had small leaves. The dogwoods were white, and here and there redbud showed its bright head. We could smell the fragrance of the wild crabapple before we came near enough to see its pink blossoms. We said goodbye to our little playmate, and she went on alone toward her home. After we had eaten dinner, put up the dishes, and fed the baby chicks, we went down to the old bridge to play. Its beams were made of long logs with the bark left on them. It had a puncheon floor. We saw the phoebe's nest, which was made of mud and grass and plastered underneath one of the beams. The male bird was sitting up on his usual lookout, an oak limb that hung over the bridge, and we'd heard his rapid, jerky "Phoebe, Phoebe," repeated for several minutes at dawn every morning for a week. He twitched his tail continually as he looked for insects that were sure to pass sooner or later. We watched him catch the insects, and he did not seem to mind. A flock of white-throated sparrows industriously scratched among the dead leaves in the underbrush. When they saw us, they gave a startled chirp and dashed out of sight. But soon we heard one of them sing its high-pitched, clear whistle, "Peabody bird, Peabody bird." They had wintered with us, but we knew they would soon be on their way to the far north to build their nest and spend the summer. We started back to the house to help with the evening chores. We found a chipping sparrow's nest in a raspberry bush about 3 feet from the ground. It had 4 bluish-green eggs in it. They were speckled, mostly around the large end, with dark brown. We found a bluebird's nest in a hole in a gatepost with pale bluish eggs. There was a robin's nest in the pear tree with 2 eggs in it. The Carolina wrens were feeding their babies in the buggy shed. A house wren's harsh call came from the oak. Then it burst into song. A robin called from its home in the pear tree, and from the orchard a cardinal's soft call was heard, and then its sweet plaintive notes. A mockingbird sang lightly at the top of the tree. Guinea fowl chattered noisily as they went to roost. Bells tinkled as the cows came home. Lambs frolicked in the field in front of the house. Neighboring farmers called their hogs. Negro children laughed merrily as they played games near the cabin on the hill. The sunset's afterglow faded. A new moon hung low. Pale stars came out in the turquoise sky. There was no sound, just the stillness and the peace and the beauty of the night. No one lived within half a mile of us except the darkies. They went to bed early, and we could not see the lights from any of our neighbors' homes. There were woods between our house and theirs, and when darkness settled over everything, we were in a small world of our own. Smelled the dewy scents of the night. The odor of garden soil that had just been turned was heavy. The fragrance of serviceberry, apple, and cherry blossoms mingled with the aroma of cedar. The strange but not unpleasant scent of the pendant catkins on all the varieties of oak, such as turkey, red, Spanish, black, barren, scrub, white, and post, had drifted in from the woods and settled in our valley. The thin moon went down behind the trees. Mother called us. It was bedtime. Reluctantly, we left the porch where we had been sitting and went indoors. With lagging steps but happy hearts, we climbed the stairs and went to bed. Chapter 14. My First School Days. I went to school my first term in a log schoolhouse, which had been built many years before. The floor was made of rough planks. The seats were made of 7-foot planks which had been hand-planed. They had no backs. These uncomfortable benches were placed 2 feet apart on either side of the room. The girls sat on one side and the boys on the other. There was a platform about 3 feet wide and 4 feet high across the back end of the room, where the pupils kept their books. The teacher kept his straight split-bottom chair directly in front of the platform. He often had to get the blue-backed spelling books for the little folk. He was custodian of everyone's possessions. It was hard to keep up with our books, slate, pencils, copybook, pen, and ink. We had no lead pencils. We had a breakable pencil which made white marks on the slate. Each child was supposed to have a small sponge to erase pencil marks, but often we would spit either on our slate or fingers and wipe the marks off. The next year the log house was torn down and a frame house was built on the same spot. It had weatherboards painted white, a shingle roof, 3 large windows on each side, a smooth tongue-and-groove floor, and handmade wooden desks which were wide enough to seat 2 pupils. Lunch baskets and buckets were placed on the 2 long shelves near the door. Coats and bonnets were hung on wooden pegs above the bench on the girls' side, and in winter the girls' overshoes were placed underneath it. The schoolhouse was on the edge of a wood. The playground contained several acres. The most of it was owned by one of my uncles, and he made no objection to the schools using it. The girls were permitted to play on one side of the road and the boys on the other. The schoolyard was for all the pupils. We would never go so far but what we could hear the school bell when it was time for books to begin. In the middle of the morning, the teacher would dismiss us for a 15-minute recess. Lily and I would rush to our lunch basket and take out a piece of fried ham, a biscuit, and either an apple or a tomato, whichever was in season at the time. We would eat as fast as we could. Then we would go to the restroom, which meant going down into the woods far enough to get out of sight of the schoolyard. The rest of the time was devoted to playing games. At noon we would carry our baskets out on the schoolyard until the weather got cold. We would sit on the grass or the roots of trees and eat lunch. We would eat another slice of fried ham and whatever else Mother had provided, except 2 pieces of ham which were to be kept for the afternoon recess. We usually had something sweet, cake, sweet cakes, or pie. The pies were made either of molasses or blackberry jam. Years later I asked Mother for the recipe for making the pies which tasted so good as we sat under the tall shady oaks in close companionship with some other little girls whose ages were near our own. When we had finished our lunch, we would put our baskets away and go down into the woods and play. If we ever had any differences on the school ground, they were soon forgotten. We did not hold grudges or grievances. Our school had 3 trustees. Father was one of them. Uncle Frank was nearly always a trustee, as he had 10 children and was expected to take a great deal of interest in the school. A prospective teacher had to visit all 3 of the trustees and get their consent before he could be elected. Young ladies would ride horseback or in buggies down to our gate just before noon as we were ringing the large cowbell to call the men from the field. They would ask to see our father. Mother would invite them to come in and wait for him. They gladly accepted the invitation to have dinner with us, for they were tired and hungry from the long morning ride. The trustees had some other duties to perform besides selecting the teacher. If a big boy in school, and they were permitted to attend school until they were 21, committed an offense and was not willing to take the punishment the teacher thought he needed, the trustees would have to be called in along with the boy's father to hold a court of inquiry, so to speak. A trustee seldom had to do the whipping. The boy's father, after hearing both sides of the story, usually was willing to take that responsibility himself. As a rule, the children came from Christian homes and had some refinement. But now and then a family that was a little below par socially would move into the school district and live a short time. The children would come to school. Sometimes their language would be coarse and their manners would be rude. One morning at recess, I rushed out the door with a biscuit and a piece of ham. I was trying to catch up with some of my little playmates when I met a little boy who was coming back for more food. I accidentally stepped on his sore toe, and he cursed me. It was the first oath I had ever heard. I was so shocked I forgot to say, "I am sorry, please forgive me." In teaching beginners the alphabet, the teacher would take them one at a time and let them stand beside his chair. One day he had a tough little fellow up for instruction. He had taught him the letter A and was trying to teach him B. It was spring. The flowering shrubs and trees on the schoolyard were in bloom. A honeybee came buzzing in through the open window and settled on the little boy's shirt sleeve. "What is that on your sleeve?" the teacher asked. The little boy looked at the wrong sleeve. "Jesus Christ, God Almighty, it's snot," he answered. At 4 o'clock, the teacher would say, "Put your books away," and then, "You are dismissed for today." In summer, we would grab our bonnets and lunch basket and start down the dusty road. Only a few children went our way, and they soon left us to go in another direction. With shouts of goodbye to our little friends, we would hasten on our way home. In winter, we would put on our wraps and overshoes and go down the muddy road toward the dearest place in our small world and help Mother with the evening chores. 15. My youngest sister. On one cold, blustery night in early March, our father awakened us before dawn. He told us to dress and put on our coats and bonnets. He took our little sister Mary in his arms, and we set out to visit our Uncle Perry and his family, a half-mile away. When we reached the horse lot, the hired man was coming out the front gate leading Wheeler, Father's saddle horse. He fastened the gate, got on the horse, and started off at a brisk foxtrot. As we walked along the muddy lane behind Father in the dim light, our eyes heavy with sleep, I wondered if he had lost his senses. When we got to our uncle's house, his daughter, Cousin Dora, put us to bed, and our father went home. We had breakfast there, and all through the morning we had a nice time playing indoors with the little girl who lived there, and whom our aunt and uncle had reared as their own child. After lunch, while we were still having a good time playing games, we looked out the window and saw Dr. Crenshaw going by on his white horse. He had his handmade leather saddlebags, in which he carried his pills and potions and surgical instruments, swung across his saddle. He was on his way back to town. He stopped at the gate, and our uncle rushed out. After a short conversation, the doctor rode on. The hired man had ridden to town early that morning and called him after he had gone by Aunt Emily's house. When our uncle came back into the house, he smiled at us and told us we had a new baby sister at home. Our cousin soon took us home, as we were eager to see the new baby. We did not know just exactly where it came from. One person told us the doctor had brought it in his saddle pockets. Another person told us Aunt Emily had brought it in her satchel. All the little girls in the neighborhood knew that every time Aunt Emily got up before day, took her satchel, and rode to a farmhouse, a baby was left there. After hearing other children talk, we decided that Aunt Emily had brought us our sister. They told of instances in which there had been no doctor present, just Aunt Emily, and there had been babies left at their houses. Mother named the baby Lena, for Lena Rivers. She was a sweet baby and grew to be a dear little girl with laughing brown eyes, a sunny disposition, and a kind heart. She was the last baby that came to live with us. The years passed quickly by. In a short time, my youngest sister was old enough to walk over the nearby fields and woods with Mary and me in search of the first wild flowers of spring, violets, blue-eyed grass, and hepatica. She always wore a pink chambray sunbonnet with strings that tied under her chin. She sang as she went along, her bonnet pushed back, showing her light brown hair. Chapter 16. The Man Who Would Not Stay in His Grave. Mr. Humphrey Lawrence lived nearly a half-mile east of Oak Grove Church. His house was on level ground on top of a slope, but the road went down the slope to the creek, wandered beside the creek for 100 yards or so, and then up the western slope to the church. In the early days, someone had dug a well, which never went dry, at the foot of the slope near the creek. It furnished water for the family's every need. At that time, no one thought it a great task to carry water up the slope to the house. Mr. Humphrey lived out his allotted time and grew old, as all mortals do. He got sick and took to his bed. He had but a few days to live. The news was passed from mouth to every house in the neighborhood. Buried Mr. Humphrey on the slope beside the road, about halfway between the house and the well. In time the earth settled hard over the coffin, and the grave was covered with wild grass. But somehow Mr. Humphrey would not stay in his grave. In some mysterious way he would escape and hang about the well on dark nights. The well was boxed in with wide planks, and sometimes he would be seen bending over it, drawing up a 10-quart zinc bucket of water. Again one could hear the water splash, splash, deep down in the sandstone-lined well as he tried to sink the empty bucket. At other times the bucket would be sitting by the well, and he would be slacking his thirst from a long-handled gourd. The strange thing about it was that the bucket was always there, but the gourd could never be found. No one wanted to pass the well at night alone. When the boys had to go that way after seeing their best girls home, one could hear the clatter of their horses' iron shoes on the rocky slope as they rode at breakneck speed. At Christmas time, when the boys were a little more daring than usual, several of them would pass by in a group and call out to Mr. Humphrey to catch them. Immediately he would appear from nowhere, right in front of them, and almost grasp their bridle reins. They had to ride for their lives, but fortunately none of them were ever caught. Chapter 17. My father's brother Fank was one of my favorite uncles. He was named for one of the heroes of the Revolutionary War, Francis Marion, but no one ever called him by that name. Uncle Fank always had a twinkle in his eyes when he was amused. He was more talkative than my father and some of his other brothers. He was a man of strong opinions and had no hesitancy in expressing them when he thought the occasion warranted it. Uncle Fant did not get married until he was 38. Sometime in his middle 30s he decided to build a house for himself on his portion of the land and keep bachelor's hall. He built the house a mile and a half from grandmother's place, which was my childhood home. When he had completed the house and moved into it, two of his grown-up nieces insisted that he give them a party. He agreed to let them have a social on one condition: they were not to invite any trundle-bed trash. That name was applied to girls who were grown in size but not old enough to be on the carpet. The trundle bed was a low bed that ran on casters which could be rolled under the father's and mother's bed in the day and trundled out at night for the small children in the family to sleep on. These low beds were much used in homes where there was a lack of bedrooms or floor space. The expression "on the carpet" was used to denote a girl who was old enough to receive company in the parlor. Often the parlor was the only room in the house that had a carpet on the floor. Soon after the party was over, it was rumored that Uncle Fant was courting a fine-looking young widow near the southern border of the county. It gave the whole family a surprise when he married the widow's 15-year-old daughter and brought his youthful bride to share his new home. When I could first remember Aunt Forrest, she was a plump woman with light brown hair, soft brown eyes, and a gentle voice and manner. Because of the great difference between their ages, Uncle Fant often treated her more like a daughter than his wife. She didn't seem to mind, and he made all the important decisions and took upon himself all the responsibilities of life. She was the mother of 14 children, and 10 of them lived to be grown. Gertie, the 7th child and the second daughter in the family, was one of my best friends during my childhood. As we went around visiting all the families on Father's side of the house, we could always look forward to having a good time when we went to Uncle Fant's to spend the day. After we were grown, Lily and I used to go there to visit the girls on Saturday night and Sunday. On Sunday morning, Uncle Fant would get up a little later than usual, as that was always a day of leisure for the boys in the family. The 4 oldest boys had their bedroom on the 2nd floor over the parlor. After Uncle Fant had been up for some time, he would go into the front hall and call each one of the boys by name, but not a sound would be heard upstairs. After a few minutes had slipped by, he would go back into the hall and call the boys again. Still there would be no answer. But after a few more minutes had passed, Aunt Forrest would say in her soft voice, "Fant, tell the boys breakfast is ready." In a short time, the boys would be dressed and seated at the long table in the kitchen, along with the rest of us. 14 in all. Breakfast was a full meal in that home. Always there were buttermilk and soda biscuits made with plenty of lard mixed in to make them tender, which were baked in large black iron pans that fitted inside the oven of the box stove, which was heated with wood. There was a big platter piled high with fried ham, another huge flat dish of eggs fried in the ham fat, a big deep bowl of red gravy, New Orleans molasses, peach preserves, and blackberry jam. The preserves and jam were served in beautiful old-fashioned covered preserve stands of glass, and usually there was a bowl of honey from the row of hives in the front yard that was strung along the north fence that separated the yard from the orchard. Uncle Fant was what our neighborhood called a good provider. He looked after the welfare of his large family. He also took time to have some beauty about the home. He grew roses in the yard from cuttings or slips which his friends gave him. They were a source of joy and pride to him, and were admired by everyone who visited there or passed that way. In summer, many beautiful potted plants were kept on a long, narrow side porch that extended from the front hall to the end of the kitchen. These plants belonged to Aunt Forrest, but Uncle Fant took care of them. There I saw my first hydrangeas and many other gorgeous plants in bloom. When winter came, these plants were kept in a pit that had been dug in a sunny place in the backyard. Please turn to 2B.